Now I'm going to present briefly Fernando Domínguez Rubio, which is who is the keynote of this first session. And well, first I have to thank everybody for being here, and Fernando, which is also he has just had a baby. No, it's a great it's great to have him here, which is like a short period of time from that. He's assistant professor of the Department of Communication at University of California, San Diego, and as he himself explains, as he's trained as a cultural sociologist, but his work is remarkably interdisciplinary, drawing from disciplines as diverse as science and technology studies, anthropology, arts, and architecture. No? He has been working in the study of material ecologies and infrastructures enable contemporary cultural, aesthetic, and political forms. For example, he has been also European Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Sociology, New York University, at Center for Research and Sociocultural Change at the Open University, research associate also at the Center for Social and Cultural Research at the Open University, and also he has been supervisor at the University of Cambridge. Well, he has participated in different funded research projects, and you can look at his website and download some of his articles, which you will find also, I'm sure you will find truly interesting, about infrastructures and art. And for example, I have a recent one from politics and design, which is also really interesting, and many others. And he will explain, he will talk about art betwixt and between objects and things, no? And he will explain you better what is this all about. And let's welcome Fernando Domínguez. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Actually, I'm realizing that probably you don't see the corner, right? Some of you don't see, well, I think that I don't have many stuff here, so I hope you can see the screen. So thank you very much, Paul, for the invitation. Thank you very much for putting together the conference. It's great to be here. And well, so what I'm going to be presenting today is part of a book that I'm writing. And what I've decided to do is to, in a way, sacrifice depth for breadth. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things, and in a superficial way, but I hope that in the Q&A we will have an opportunity to discuss some things, but I will go very quickly over many different things. So I have divided the talk in three sections. The first one is an intro, which is kind of boring, but I need to do it so to set the terms of the debate that I want to present today. Then the second one is what I really care about, and is this idea of ecological machines of contemporary art. And the third one is a continuation of that theme, and I will be talking about the challenge of new media for museums. So let's start with the intro, and that is of objects and things. In very broad terms, these are the kind of questions that I'm trying to address, both in the book and in this talk today. And the questions are, first, under what particular conditions do some things become legible, effective, and reproducible as particular kinds of objects? How are those conditions produced and maintained? And finally, under what conditions does something ceases to count as an object and becomes something else? Now, this, in a way, is a strange way of phrasing things because normally we tend to assume that objects and things are the same thing. We normally use it in daily language as perfect synonyms, and we use them interchangeably. Now, what I want to suggest is that actually, I think we should understand objects and things as not only different, but I got a problem. Let's see. Are we back on? Yeah. So not only different, but discrepant phenomena. And yeah, okay. So just to give you a very, very brief definition of what I understand by one thing and the other. By things I understand material processes that unfold over time. And by objects, I mean the particular positions under which things are subsumed to. And positions are defined as a specific relation between form and matter, but that doesn't really matter now. So one way of illustrating this with a very, very simple example is to think about water. So water is a thing that can become an ice cube, so it can be put in the position of an ice cube. And to do that, you need an ice cube, tray, and a freezer, which are the technologies that actually enable us to go from things to an object, like an ice cube. I will explain this later more. So from this very stupid example, the thing that I want you to take is that the status of something as an object is not given once and for all. So the status of something as an object is a position that can be gained and can be lost. And there's a particular annoying feature of this relationship between things and objects, and is the fact that things and objects are always, always parting ways. And this is because things, as material processes, are always growing out of the object positions to which they are assigned, and they are always sliding out of joint from the expected object positions, and thus they are always creating what I call a discrepancy between objects and things. Now, this is a fancy name for something that actually we experience and suffer every single day of our lives. So just to give you very mundane examples, think, for example, of that drawer that is misaligned, that it doesn't really behave like an object, like a drawer as it's supposed to do, or that road that is constantly undoing itself through cracks and potholes. Think about that family photograph in which you can no longer discern familiar faces. Think about the wonky table that is always not aligned. Or if you have kids, you will recognize this one. Think about these little agents that manage to get everything out of joint, out of position in a house. And this is a personal one that really annoys me, and is that, you know, the trousers that after a while they're not trousers anymore. You cannot actually wear them with decorum. So what I'm trying to say is that we do not live among objects. We wish we live among objects or among things, and things and objects are rarely, if ever, aligned. So we conduct our lives in betwixt and betweens objects and things. And actually, much of our daily toil and much of our budgets is spent in trying to prevent things from veering too far away from object positions. And the problem is that actually keeping things as objects is not a light task. Think, for example, about the ongoing work of maintenance, which is the work that we do or we have to do to maintain things within their object positions. Think about repair, which is the task or the toil of bringing back things into object positions. And think about retrofitting, which is bringing other things into object positions. Okay? So now, what has all this to do with art? So I'm raising this question. So the same thing that I've talked about with any kind of the difference between things and objects, I want to address the particular question to the question of art. And the question is, under what particular conditions does something become legible, effective, and reproducible as an art object? So that's the question that guides my research, and this is now the second part of the talk. And I did this research at MoMA, and of course, everything that I've talked about now, this is something that I have constructed after I did the research. When I started the research, my initial question was much more naive and simple. So I had one empirical question when I started to do the ethnography at MoMA, and the question was very simple, is what are the actual practices and technologies through which art objects are preserved? So I did this ethnography at the conservation department in the museum. And that was my initial question, and I just asked people around about how do you keep art objects? And of course, the surprise for me was that, as everybody knows, in a museum, they say, objects, what objects? We don't have objects in a museum. What we have are slow events. So in any object in the museum, even the most simple one, like an oil on canvas, is always changing and transforming as a result of changes in temperature, in light, in humidity. So rather than a fixed object, what you have is an unfolding process, which in the eyes of the people in the museum is actually a slowly unfolding disaster. That's how you can define what an artwork is within the museum. And it's a slowly unfolding disaster because it's always drifting away from the prescribed, from its prescribed objecthood, from what is supposed to be. So the task of the museum, I argue, is actually not to represent objects or to exhibit objects. The first and foremost task of the museum is to produce objects, to turn those slow events, those things, into objects. Now, there's a problem with that is that actually the museum cannot produce any kind of object. It has to produce a very specific form of objecthood, which is the one that distinguishes art objects from any other kind of object. And you have to remember that art can be anything, but not anything can be an art object. And there are a couple of conditions that something has to have in order to qualify as an art object. And one that I'm going to hold on to is that in order for something to be an art object, it must be legible as the original, singular, and authentic product of the artist's intention and creative agency. So the object has to be legible as an intentional object. Because when it ceases to be legible as such, then you don't really know if it is an art object or what it is. And I'll give you this example. You remember this one? So this is something that has probably drifted too far away from what it's supposed to be, and nobody knows what it is anymore. So if you want a more sophisticated, or I think that this is a very sophisticated example, you can think of Eva Hess. So this is one of her pieces, Expanded Expansion, made in 1969. And it was made of latex. And of course, 30 years, well, no, more, 50 years later, this is what has happened to that piece. Now, the transformation of the piece is so radical that it has created a huge debate in the art world as to whether this should be exhibited or not, because nobody no longer knows if this is actually still an art object or it has become a ruin that contains the memory of an art object, but is not an art object anymore. They're still debating on whether this, actually the consensus is that this should not be exhibited. It's a ruin. It's not an art object anymore because it doesn't contain, it doesn't represent the artist's intention. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that to prevent this from happening, to prevent these things from becoming something else, the museum has to produce what I call ecological machines. And ecological machines, the dense definition, as I define it, is you can understand them as forms of containment and maintenance organized around different infrastructures, technologies, and practices that operate to produce and sustain the rather peculiar conditions under which things can be rendered legible, representable, and be reproducible as art objects. So this is very long, very dense, so I'm gonna just break it in different parts and analyze every component of these ecological machines. So the first one is infrastructures. And what I want to argue is that art objects require radically artificial environments to be possible, durable, and reproducible. So one of the most important places in any museum and at MoMA is the machine room, where the boilers and the steamers are. Because these machines are actually what supplies the atmospheres of art, what makes possible the living environments in which things can behave as art objects. Now, one of the problems that the museums have is that actually artworks can only behave as objects temporarily and within highly artificial climatic conditions. So for example, in the case of an oil painting like this, the temperature has to be within that range, humidity has to be within that range, light has to be within that range, and air has to be of a particular kind with a specific concentration of pollutants. So if you want to have the Demoiselle Savignon as an art object and keep it stable, that's the particular band of climatic conditions within which it behaves and can behave and remain stable as an object. Of course, the museum has to produce then what I call object-sustaining environments. And this is one of them. This is the storage facility, one of the storage facilities at MoMA. And here, the museum can actually produce very stable conditions because there are no people around. So they can create with these computers, they can keep the climate stable. But this is a very, very fragile environment, even if it is a very controlled environment. So just to give you an idea, you can see that peak there, and that's probably because someone opened a door for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, so the whole environment was disrupted. And that is important because actually that detracts years of life to an artwork. So if you preserve something, an oil painting at 21 degrees, it can last for 100 years. If you preserve it at 10 degrees, it can last for 1,000 years. So one of the things that I'm trying to say with this is that actually in art theory and in social sciences, climatic conditions, things like air, light, temperature, have been dramatically under-theorized because normally they are understood as just providing the background of where all the action takes place, where art takes place, where social life takes place. And what I'm trying to suggest is actually that those climatic conditions are actually the very medium through which life takes place, and things like objects art objects takes place. And these environments, actually, what I want to suggest is that they're not what surround subjects. They are actually what specifies subjects, what defines subjects. So a cold environment actually makes possible a durable object. A warmer environment makes possible a more fragile object. So actually, the environment is actually what defines the feature of that object, whether that is durable, more fragile, more transient, etc. So that's what happens within the storage facility, which is a very controlled environment. But of course, the problem comes when you move to the museum itself, because that's where the two worst enemies of art inhabit, and that is humans and insects. So one of the problems that you have is how do you produce an environment in a place that has humans breathing, opening doors, closing doors, disrupting any kind of environment. So you have to create a very highly engineered space full of little contraptions, like, for example, those doors that separate environments. That's a photograph gallery, so that has to be much colder than the rest. You have to dim light in different ways, but still enable light so that people can actually see in the museum. So you have to create this convoluted engineered environment through architecture that actually makes possible preserving or creating object-sustaining environments within the museum. Now, the artificiality of this environment is such that they are incredibly expensive. At MoMA, keeping the environment of the museum is the single most expensive item in the budget for the museum outside acquisitions. So you have acquisitions, and then you have climatic control in the museum. So you cannot, it's so expensive because you cannot switch off this thing. So it has to be continually running to be able to keep things as objects, which actually makes a museum one of the most polluting buildings in the world. Which brings me to the question that probably you can start comparing Picassos with SUVs, because both are, as the footprint of both are probably very comparable. Anyway, so that's one. Then the second element is technologies. The second element of these ecological machines is technologies. They have to have a lot of technologies. And this is because this form of objecthood, the one that defines art objects, requires a system of objective metrics, which are in place to make sure that when you go to the museum, what you see is still a valid representation or a valid representation of the artist's intent. So you're seeing actually what the artist painted, sculpted, or built. And they have to make sure that that is still a valid representation of what the artist did, and you're not seeing any other thing. So I'm gonna give you one example, and this is it's an example, a recent example. This is Pollock #1, which underwent treatment a few months ago at MoMA. And when they try to clean it, the problem here is, of course, that the conservators and curators have to discern which material trace that they see in the painting reveal the artist's intention, and which ones don't, are just dirt or things that the artist didn't want to be there. Because it is only insofar as they do that they can actually say, okay, this has value, this has a meaning, this has to stay, this is valueless, meaningless, we have to clean it, take it away. Now, the problem was that when they started to do this, they found three things in this one. And remember that in the case of Pollock, it's a little bit more convoluted and complex, because Pollock is the painter of the unconscious. So what they had to determine is actually intentionally unconscious behavior, which is much more difficult. So they found these three things. And one of them is Pollock unconsciousness, they said. The second one, they realized that actually they found that actually when they were doing the treatment is that there are a couple of things that were, they said, fine-tuning. So it seems that actually Pollock was going back, seeing the whole thing, not doing the unconscious automatic painting, and then fine-editing the painting. But then they said, okay, that is not the unconscious Pollock, but it's still Pollock, so it's still meaningful and valuable, so it has to stay. And then they actually found that when the painting was in a guy's studio, the guy painted it and painted it over and painted it with pink, and that is that part there. So that doesn't belong to Pollock. So that has to be eliminated. It has to be cleaned because it is not part of Pollock. It is distorting the authenticity of the painting. So that goes. So. This practice, and through these technologies, what they're actually trying to determine is the difference between object and thing. So the thing is that thing that is changing and acquiring things that are undesired additions to the painting, and they have to decide which traits belong to the thing that is changing and which traits belong to the art object and what needs to stay. And that is done through adjudication and attribution. So this belongs to Pollock, this belongs to dirt. And this is done through competing forms of judgment and knowledge, because you have to remember, well, many of you probably are museum people, so you know that the battle between conservators and curators, conservators have scientific knowledge to do this, or they claim they do, and curators have aesthetic knowledge, and those are different forms of establishing this boundary, which very often are in conflict. But I don't have time to get into detail about that. Now, the third thing that these ecological machines have to have are practices of care. So maintaining things as objects requires a lot of upkeeping and retrofitting. And in the museum, every single day, there is the process of maintenance. So this guy, for example, is measuring light, making sure that the light doesn't go unstable and damages the painting. And actually, this is a battle between conservators and curators. Curators want to have better lighting conditions. Conservators try to have better conditions for the object. So there's this battle that is a daily battle in the museum. And of course, you have practices of repair, constantly working on things so they are kept stable and they are kept within the boundaries of what they should be as authentic and original objects. Now, these processes are important because there's a way of saying that conservators are only dealing with stuff. They're just mending things, but actually that's not what they're doing. They are not just doing physical work; they are doing metaphysical work. So these are the guys that actually are keeping boundaries and categories intact. So what she's doing there, for example, is not just repairing the blue of a painting. She is actually keeping that as an intentional object, legible as an intentional object. And it's through this work of care, maintenance, and repair that things become viable as objects. If you take that away, that thing probably will collapse, and that object will collapse into something else. Now, the fourth element of these machines are what I call technologies of display. Because once you have these objects and you preserve them and you care about them, you still have to present them. And presenting them is a difficult endeavor as well. So of course, the museum has different devices to present objects or artworks as objects. One of them is, of course, the white box, which is a little machine with a specific and actually very short history, which works I want to suggest as a technology of abstraction, through which the artwork is detached from both its author and its context and comes to be represented as self-contained and autonomous object. And this effacing of context, this deletion of context makes possible the idea of a pure and undisturbed encounter between subject and object through which aesthetic judgment and experience takes place. Now, that's not the only thing that the museum needs to have to produce that kind of aesthetic knowledge or aesthetic judgment and experience. The museum needs also to make sure that there is a specific way of relating between subjects and objects to produce aesthetic experience and judgment. So the museum also is full of filled with what I call Kantian micro devices. And these little guys, what they do is make sure that objects and subjects, the only way that they relate is through sight, through vision, which is the dominant way in the Western world through which aesthetic judgment and experience takes place. Of course, you have these Kantian micro devices. You have many of them. There's a huge typology in the museum, have plenty of photographs. And basically, these are the guys who force you to have a specific way of relating to objects. And of course, sometimes these guys are not enough. So you have Kantian bodyguards. So you try to get too close to the things. They actually enforce Kantianism on you, and you cannot touch things, so you can only see them from afar to experience the thing. So these technologies of display, what they do, as I said before, is the physical work of abstraction through which the artwork comes to be represented as a self-contained and autonomous object and as the only possible locus of value and meaning. This image comes in handy because this is a Fluxus suitcase, and as some of you, or all of you know, Fluxus wasn't based on objects, it was based on events. But of course, if you're in a museum, you cannot represent, own, and exhibit an event. You can in different ways, we'll see how. So what the museum does is to transform those events or to transfer the meaning and the value of those events into the objects, so into the suitcase. So the suitcase now becomes the locus and the index of meaning and of value. And the museum engages in this kind of transforming things that are not objects into objects in many different ways. So this is, for example, the Tiravania's famous piece of relational art in which they cook Curry and the museum owns this, but in order to own it, they have to turn it into it has to have object-like properties. It has to be acquirable. In order to be acquirable, for example, one of the things through which this is done is through repetition. So repetition builds qualities of objecthood into things. And this other one, Tino Segal Kiss, this is at the Guggenheim, but MoMA owns this one. How do you own a performance? Well, you own it through repetition, through the ability to reproduce it, which is how the museum builds objecthood into something that is inherently evanescent and transient. So anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that when you go to the museum and you see what seems to be a timeless art object, what you are actually seeing is the contingent product of a very particular ecological machine. And of course, there are many of these machines around the world and for different purposes. So for example, this is an ecological machine that has a different purpose in mind. This actually is the CERN. And this one is, the purpose is to transform things into objective objects, not subjective objects like the museum. So this is a whole different machine which is engaged in another kind of transformation or movement between things and objects. Now, well, this I can skip, and the important thing is the bottom. So why is this important? Why all this effort and work into trying to produce this specific kind of object? Why all the money, why all the budgets invested into keeping things stable? Well, I think that there are a couple of reasons. So one of them is because this form of objecthood is related to a specific form of personhood. So these kinds of objects are the material correlates of a specific idea of the person understood as an individual self endowed with internal capacities such as agency, intentionality, or imagination. So this object actually is the proof of that kind of person. It evinces intentionality, it evinces that we have creativity, it evinces those kinds of things. So building that object actually is you're building a specific kind of person or a specific kind of agent. Now, the second thing is that this form of objecthood actually enables a particular way of producing narratives, meaning, and chronologies. Because these, once you have artworks represented as detachable objects, they come to be represented as autonomous and self-contained objects that they can be seen as part of a larger system of objects. That's how we understand art, as a system of objects in which they can be compared among themselves. So this is very, once you have those objects and they are seen as autonomous objects, you can compare them and you can establish like formal comparisons about it, and you can talk about style, you can talk about form, and then you can think about art history as the history of objects, their forms, and their styles, which is the dominant way in which we have narrated our history, is through objects. And the third one, which is very important for me, is that this form of objecthood creates the kind of physical evidence that law, and specifically copyright law, requires to operate. It is only insofar you have that kind of object that you can have what is called in copyright law a tangible expression of the artist's mind, and that becomes a subject, something that can be subjected to appropriation and rights. So one of the problems that, for example, MoMA had with Fluxus and with many other things is that if you don't have a tangible expression, you cannot own it. So the museum has to produce or have to transfer the event, the Fluxus event, into a suitcase to claim property and copyright rights over the suitcase. So then what I'm trying to say then is that the museum produces and stabilizes through these ecological machines one of the forms of objecthood that the art system, as a system of value, meaning, and property, requires to operate. I'm emphasizing one because the museum is not the only machine that operates in the art world. You can have this one, which is an art fair, and here you don't need to make things stable ad aeternum. So you don't, what you need to do actually is to, the whole purpose of this machine is actually to transform things into a sellable commodity, which is not the same thing that the museum does. The museum doesn't need to produce a sellable community, it has to produce a timeless object. So here you have a whole different architecture and a whole different ecological machine that I haven't studied, but it's a different one, okay? So that's the first task that these ecological machines have to perform, which is to stabilize artworks as objects. And it's not the only one. The second one is that, how am I doing with time? Okay. So the second one is that they have to place these subjects into physical narratives and spaces. So you have this, and then you have to produce narratives with these subjects. Now, one of the things that I want to suggest is that actually narratives are not just discursive phenomena as they have always, or they have tended to be described, but they should be understood as ecological phenomena. So they come to exist within particular architectural and environmental configurations. And I use the word emplacing that comes from a sociologist, that is actually to put into place. So a narrative has to be put into a place. I'm going to skip this, but this is just to say that actually different architectural configurations enable different forms of telling things or of creating narratives. These are the 4 iterations that MoMA has had thus far, and each one enable a different way of organizing objects to produce narratives. One of the problems with the old building was that the building only allowed one particular way of moving across the building, which was like an arrow, which actually was very fitting for the curators at the time because they did have that kind of imagination of art history unfolding like an arrow. So it was quite fitting for them that the building actually made possible the kind of narratives that they wanted to produce. But then a younger generation of creators came around, and they wanted to tell their art history in a different way through juxtapositions and contradictions and stuff like that. And of course, the building didn't allow that kind of thing, so they had to redo the floor of all the galleries in the museum. Anyway, so what I'm trying to suggest here is that one of the big problems that you have in a museum is that you don't only have to produce a narrative, you have to put it in space, and one of the big problems that the museum has, the curators have, is to move from one-dimensional space to three-dimensional space. So you have a narrative, and you put your narrative there on the board. That's how I want my exhibition to be. But then you have to go into the gallery, and these are the models that they use to move from one space to the other. And here they play, and they know that they can only place the objects in different ways because they have the HVAC system, the different lights, the windows. So they have to play around with this model. And of course, once you finish this, you still have to go to the gallery and to build the narrative in the narrative. And the point that I want to make here is that very often we see we find this idea that the museum is just the repository of narratives that are produced somewhere else. So this exhibition is just an example of Western domination or things like that. And it's true, but that is incomplete, because even if you want to produce an exhibition that is about Western domination or whatever, you still have to produce it in space and through space. And those narratives have to be spatially and climatically negotiated. And when you do that, actually, you find out that one of the most difficult parts of the museum is to deal with the seemingly stupid and meaningless stuff. Like, for example, where is the loading bin? Where are the windows? Where are the fire extinguishers? Where do we have the lights? And that is through that negotiation that you produce a narrative in space, something that most often is ignored by art critics, who see that and see that it's just what the curator wanted, and it's an expression of the curator's intent or will, and that's actually not how it happens. So okay, so this is the second task of these ecological machines, is to place objects into narratives. And then the third one is that they have to produce spaces of cohabitation, because it's important to remember that the museum is a site of public demonstration and a space of judgment. So these material ecologies, or these ecological machines, have to produce environments that are livable for artworks, but also for people. And that's sometimes very tricky. And I'm going to give you just one example. This is the outdoor patio sculpture at the museum, and it's a complex, very complex space in the museum, because you have social constituents, that is people, and people come with different bodies. So you have to create a built environment that actually makes possible the navigation of the museum to different bodies. You have aesthetic constituents, that's the art, that, as I said before, requires a very specific kind of containment to be kept stable, which is very difficult in an open-air location like this one. And you have natural constituents like the weather, trees, and stuff like that. And the problem, of course, is how do you make possible that these three things occupy the same space? And you have to negotiate different comforts. And it's always a problem because the environments that are more comfortable for people tend to be the ones that are more difficult for objects, and the ones that are more comfortable for objects are the ones that tend to be more uncomfortable for people. So there's this constant tug of wars between who do you privilege in the museum, people or objects. And of course, well, the architect says that everybody hates architects because they are the ones that then create a building that actually makes this cohabitation absolutely impossible. This is one of the galleries in the museum that has all these frontal windows that actually melt artworks within not seconds, but in a couple of years. And this is the incredible New Louvre by Jacques Nouvel, which is like a Gruyere cheese, and all the lights are basically like laser pointing to artworks. It's impossible to have an artwork there. It'll create like holes like this in the artwork if you leave it there for too long. Okay, so these are the three tasks that these ecological museums have to do. They have to stabilize artworks as objects, they have to place objects in narratives, and they have to produce spaces of cohabitation in which objects and people can live together. Now, the problem is that, of course, not every artwork lends itself equally to these processes of objectification and placement and cohabitation. Some artworks behave as what I call docile objects, and these are the good guys in the museum. These are the ones that occupy their position, they don't create a fuss, and they stay stable, they stay put, and they're the good citizens of the museum. And then you have the reticent objects, which are the ones that actually, reticent and unruly objects, which are the ones that cannot be easily placed within object positions. I'm going to pass this. So this is an example of an ideal citizen of the museum. This is Van Gogh Starry Night, who is very well behaved. You can leave it, it can be exhibited for a long time. People, it's like a pet, so people can be near it, they can take pictures, and it doesn't really, it's not bothered much. So these kind of objects enable a smooth reproduction of subject and object in the museum, enable the standardization of practices, classifications, meanings. They allow for continuity and permanence. And then you have the reticent objects in the museum, or unruly, I should say unruly. And this is one example, it's one of my favorites. So this is Katrina Fritsch figure group that was placed in the garden. This is the artist placing it, and again, it's very difficult, so they had to bring a huge crane because each sculpture weighs like a couple, almost like a half ton or something like that, and they're very delicate. This is how they looked right after it was placed there, and this is how it looked the day after. It rained in New York, and in New York, rain is very corrosive. So this, within a day, all the painting was going away. So this was even before the museum opened the exhibition. So they had to call the artist conservator to fly from Germany. The guy of the face says it all when he found out that what has happened to the sculpture. So he has to repaint everything before the exhibition opens. And then they open, they keep it more or less stable, but then it rains in New York again, and then it creates a huge pool of water, so nobody can get closer to the artwork because the museum is liable for any injury that may happen within their premises. So you have to have bodyguards to ensure that nobody gets close to the artwork. So these are the unruly objects of the museum, which are normally described in the museum as problems, disruptions, glitches. They disrupt established dynamics and routines. They force new collaborations and adjustments. They challenge institutional subject and object positions. In short, they create discontinuity and change. Now, so you can describe a museum as the ongoing effort to transform unruly objects into docile objects. And the extent to which the museum succeeds in this is what enables the reproduction of the regimes of value, meaning, and property that define art as a relatively autonomous system of unique, original, and authentic objects. And we have created a huge machine of the last century to make sure that this happens. This is like the hardware that we have at our disposal to make sure that things become art objects for a while. Now, there's a problem with this, and the problem is that we have entered, over the last 2 decades or so, a new age in which we are no longer producing producing ourselves in iron, in wood, in marble. We are producing ourselves or our cultural products through environments like this, digital environments, and like this, like plastic, these new materials. So I'm going to focus on, and this is the last bit of the talk, in the kind of disruptions that the digital medium is creating in this ecological machine. It's like a Trojan horse that has entered the museum and has changed the whole material infrastructure of culture and challenges the institutional logic upon which the museum has traditionally relied to generate and distribute value, meaning, property, and personhood. It does so because I want to argue that the digital operates on a different regime of objecthood, which cannot produce the kind of stable objects upon which the art system has traditionally relied for its reproduction. And I'm saying that this actually happened because the digital is effecting a 4-4 displacement of the art object. So I'm going to go through the 4 displacements that the digital is creating to the art object. The first one is that the digital is moving or creating a displacement from stable to what I call circulating objects. One of the big problems with any digital media-based artwork is obsolescence. So any digital artwork is based on stuff like this, which is very short-lived. So you can have, from reels that last for 2 to 10 years to a hard drive that lasts from 5 to 100 years. That means that nobody really knows for how long they last or how reliable they are. So that's a very, very unstable hardware. But actually, the software is even worse. So the software environments in which these things rely is even more unstable and fragile. So one of the problems that you have with this is the problem of what I call cultural irretrievability, which means that you can have a marble sculpture that was made 500 years ago, but it's very difficult to preserve something that was made 30 years ago or 20 years ago using Windows 93. So those objects of the recent past can become irretrievable. We cannot rescue them from the past. So in order to avoid this, you have to have a process of what I call cultural migration, which means that if you want to keep those things alive, they have to be continually moving from one technological platform to the next one to avoid becoming irretrievable or obsolete. And of course, to do that, you need new machines. And this is my favorite machines in the whole museum. They call it the belly of the monster. So what it is actually, you can read it like a geological cat. So what you have there is a machine that has all the technology, well, many of the technology that artists have used the last 30 years from, what is that? I don't remember it's a laser disc or a U-matic player, and then you have DVDs, different things. So actually what that works like a time machine. So it enables something that was produced in the 70s to move up to the present and so that it can be representable today. And of course, as technology advances, you will have more layers of technologies built on that. Now that actually changes the logic of the museum because the whole museum was based on the premise of less stabilized things so that we can preserve them. But of course, if you try to stabilize a digital artwork, it dies. So you have to keep them circulating. So now the logic of cultural reproduction is not stabilization, but circulation. You have to make sure that they keep moving. So basically this creates a system of enforced circulation in which the artwork has to become detachable, it can be movable, and it can exist in multiple objects, and it has to become a circulating object. So that's the first displacement. The second one is from unique to multiplying objects. Now, imagine that you're a curator at MoMA, and you go to a gallery, and you really like a piece of digital art that you see, and you decide to acquire it. So this is the digital piece that you want to acquire. Of course, you talk to the artist, and then he says, actually, that was just an exhibition copy. I have made like 3 exhibition copies, and I have the uncompressed file in my studio. And the museum says, okay, so we'll buy the uncompressed file, but of course, it's too delicate, so we're not gonna use that on a daily basis. So we're gonna make a submaster, which is the one that we're gonna use if we have exhibitions or people want to loan the art from us, and we're gonna make exhibition copies from that. And of course, 20 years go by, and all those technologies have become obsolete, so you have to create a new batch of copies. So what you have is something like this. This is actually a real diagram from Tate representing one art object. And this is how the art object exists in the museum through 20 or 30 copies. So what you have then is that the digital is not only creating a system of enforced circulation, but also of enforced dissemination. These things have to multiply as they move over time. So you have not unique objects, but you have multiple objects. The third one is that they go from individual to collective objects. As I was saying before, you have to keep these things moving. Now, the problem with this is that, of course, as they keep moving, they have to go through different technologies, and each technology produces objects in different ways. An MP3 file is not the same as a WAV file, is not the same as a MIDI file. All of this, and the same with programming language, they produce objects with different qualities and different properties. So what you actually are doing is that you have to create different things, but if they are to be seen as an art object, even if you're producing different things, they have to be seen as the same object. And this requires a whole new technology. These are guys in the museum, and what they're doing is that every new copy made in a different medium is guaranteed to be the same as the previous one. So we haven't changed it much. So that, for example, what they're looking at is what is the MoMA seal of authenticity. So they created a way of measuring if the new object is the same as the migrated object is the same as the previous one, so that when they represent it in an exhibition, they say, no, this, yeah, is an artwork that is now in a different format, but it's the same one. We haven't changed it. It's the same thing. So what that means is that the individual artwork has to become collective. It has to go through all this technical or technological process. So their work is not an index of just the artist's creative index. It's an index of a collective socio-technical process, which brings into view a proliferation of authors. And this is very problematic in the art world and in the museum world. So just to give you an example, this is Warhol's motion pictures exhibition, and this is the first time that MoMA showed or exhibited artworks that had been digitized in the museum, by the museum. And of course, the problem was that the art world didn't know what to do with this because they were not the original ones that Warhol had shot. These were just digital reproductions. So many of the critics said, are they authentic artworks or reproductions? Are they documents or some kind of in-between hybrid? That's the problem that they have, is that these reproduced, migrated things do not have a specific position or a clear position within the art world because they are not the same kind of authentic, original object that we are used to deal with. Finally, is from single to distributed objects. So this is I Want You to Want Me, and it's a piece that is an interactive screen in which harvests data from online data sites. So online dating sites. So each balloon is the profile of someone writing in a dating site. I don't need to explain you this. So but the thing is that the museum, they had it in an exhibition, and then they decided to acquire it. The only thing that you have to remember is that this is something that is connected to the internet. Okay, so it harvests that data from the internet. So then the creator said, okay, it's quite cool, so let's bring it to the museum and acquire it for the collection. So they did what they normally do. So they went to the artist studio, got the screen, which has a hard drive inserted and brought it to the museum, and then they tried to turn it on, and it didn't work. So the whole thing was blank and didn't know what was happening. And of course, what was happening, why it didn't work, is because the artwork is a distributed object. It's not a unique object that is in the monitor. It's something that exists across different sites. So it has servers that actually were in California. It has the internet dating sites, and it have different protocols to communicate those parts. So if you try to plug it in, switch it on in the museum, of course it's not going to work because it relies on this distributed architecture. So the museum said, okay, so we have really messed up here. We have to make this, since we have bought it, we have to be able to exhibit it and turn it on. So this is our shopping list. So we own the monitor, the source code, and the moving images, but we have to acquire the rest. But then they found out that actually there are things that they didn't own, but they could possibly own, like the servers and other things. But there are things that actually are not ownable by definition. And they're not ownable because they have, they're inserted in different proprietary regimes, like they have GNU license, open license software, which cannot be owned or bought or appropriated by the museum. The problem then is that these things, these kind of objects, become what I call partial possessions. So the museum can actually only own part of the object, which leaves these things in a very liminal position in between the object and the outside world, and they can never be fully appropriated, fully owned, fully integrated into the museum. So then you have distributed objects that transform the artwork into a multiple object of property, which can never be fully owned, and which implies a proliferation of owners and rights over or on the artwork. So finally, so the digital, to sum up, what I'm trying to say is that the digital is sifting the material infrastructure underpinning some of our basic cultural categories. It is transforming unique, singular, and authentic objects to circulating, disseminating, distributed, and collective objects. And these kind of objects require forms of circulation and exchange which do not support basic categories like authenticity, uniqueness, upon which we have relied to generate and define meaning, value, and rights. So we go from something like this, to something like this. Doesn't make any sense because I haven't explained, but I want to move to the conclusions. So, okay, so conclusions. So, in sum, what I'm trying to say is a couple of things. One is that the genealogy and reproduction of cultural forms, things like art objects, is material grounded and site-specific. And with this, I'm trying to say that the transformation of things into art objects is something that happens in specific places. In this case, between the 5th and the 6th Avenue of Manhattan and the 53rd and 54th Street. It doesn't happen anywhere else there. It happens there. And in order to happen there, you need to have very specific material machines or ecological machines to produce the conditions under which that transformation can take place. And these ecological machines are what makes possible, observable, and reproducible those boundaries that separate things from objects and maintain them as such over time. The third thing is that, unsurprisingly, the general laws of thermodynamics apply to cultural forms and relations. So entropy decay is actually part of us, even if social scientists don't tend to take this into account. Which actually means that the museum is kind of a necessary absurdity. So it's an absurdity because, of course, everybody knows in the museum that these things cannot last forever. They're going to disappear. They know that they cannot achieve a timeless art object, but that doesn't really matter because even if it is as they fade away and they disappear, they have to be able to hold on to them, to give them form, to separate it, to create the kind of objects that make possible the distribution of meaning, value, and property that defines our system and guarantees our system as they are in the Western world. And finally, is just probably more for social scientists, is that we have a lot of theories about power, how we impose order on things. And I think that this, if you think at what is happening in the museum, it's actually about a theory of powerlessness. So we cannot stop these things from happening because we are always defeated by these processes and because we are always living between objects and things. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Fernando, for your talk. Well, now we have time for questions. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions. I know there are a lot of PhD students here working in some of the areas that you have thought, so they might have some questions. Let's see. Okay, we are a bit late, but it's okay, but because we have scheduled an hour for coffee, which is a lot of time, so we can eat some time from this. So. Let's see, there is a micro over there. You can ask the question in Spanish or in English.
Yeah, I understand both.
Yeah, he's from Madrid, so he will understand. And anyway, we will translate it to the other ones, to the Spanish ones, and if anybody doesn't understand that. So, let's see, is there any question, let's say? Okay, here we have.
Hi. Well, thank you for your talk. I think it really explains why museums don't want digital art at all.
Yeah.
I have worked with artists talking about artworks who use data from the internet. I have worked with some artists who what they do is they keep a backup copy of this data. So in case there is no connection, they use, so it's a fiction of this data, which I think turns into this, turning into docile objects, these artworks. And all this makes me wonder that maybe what will remain of these digital artworks is just a documentation, like with performance. And I was wondering what you think about that from your experience in the museum.
So, yeah, museums didn't want a digital artwork, and now it's not a matter of wanting or not wanting, because a lot of art production is being made digitally, so they have to anyway. So it's not a choice that they have. So one of the things that is happening is actually they're developing new infrastructures to deal with artworks, to digital artworks. So the museum, for example, has created what they call the digital repository, MoMA, which tries to do that, to create backup copies in the museum and to run local copies, so they don't have to rely on the internet, which in a way, and this is the same process that has been always happening in the museum. It's the same with fluxes, for example. So you have an event and you have to turn that into an ownable and exhibitable object. And it has to undergo certain transformations. With digital art, it's the same case. They have to find a way of transforming something that is not ownable and exhibitable into an exhibitable and ownable thing, object. So this new infrastructure is trying to create that kind of thing. Whether or not, I think that actually is going to be more than archives. They can create working copies of the art. The only thing that we have to sacrifice is actually either you go, if you have authentic objects, and then the only way you can have authentic objects is by letting them die, or you accept, you give up authenticity and you have modified objects, and then you can keep them alive. So that's what happened with, for example, I Want You to Want Me, which was a digital piece, and in order to make it run, they created a data set, a local data set that runs on a server. So it's not the same piece anymore, but through that trick, they can keep it alive for longer. And of course, it relies on software and hardware that's going to be obsolescent in 5 or 10 years. If you want to keep it alive, you move it to that new software and hardware environment. It'll imply changes. It won't be the same thing of the same object, but you keep it alive. So what the museum has to face is this dilemma between authenticity and originality and survival. And they have to make a choice.
Thank you very, very much for this talk. It is a wonderful piece of analytical thinking. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask, when you mentioned that the white box produces a clear distinction between subjects and objects in which or on which the aesthetic judgment takes place, and then you were at that moment talking about objects in which the mode of public reception was basically contemplation, even though you had like the example of Tiravanilla, which would be the exception to that. But I would like you, if you could elaborate a little more on when these subjects confront, like in your examples, objects that are self-contained and autonomous, the subject that is created in that situation is also somehow self-contained and a pretension of autonomy. What happens on with these unruly objects? That don't you think that the audience itself needs to be created also by this insistence through social networks, through this constant recreation of the audience by the institution? Can you elaborate a little on which would be this relation between?
So, well, one of the things that I haven't mentioned is that my research site is very specific. This is MoMA. So this is not the most innovative museum on Earth. And is very slow in taking different changes. So at MoMA, what I was trying to say that is that the dominant way through which the museum is organized, and museums in general, is through site. Of course, that has been destabilized over the last decades by bringing relational art, olfactory art. Actually, I think that we're going to have a couple of sessions on precisely that, immersive environments of all that. And one of the things that is funny in a museum like MoMA is how uncomfortable they are when they bring these kind of things into the museum, which puts the audience in a different position from the one that they are used to have them. And in the case of a museum like MoMA, when they bring things like relational art, like the examples that I have put up, normally it's a very artificial encounter, which is choreographed, because they always want to keep people within the boundaries that they can control, so that the artwork, in the case it's an artwork that is fragile, is not broken, disrupted, or whatever. So that is actually one of the tensions that the museum has, is how these new things, these new objects, which destabilize both object and subject positions, disrupt the logic of the museum, how the museum has to renegotiate how to deal with these new situations. And in the case of a museum like MoMA, normally is not a very successful result. So for example, one of the exhibitions that they have was an interactive exhibition about design. It was design, I don't remember the title, but the thing, it was an interactive design, so they have a lot of computer games and things that actually the audience had to interact with, they had to play with. And what they did was to put everything under cases, just in case people were going to break it. So there was, of course, no interaction whatsoever. It was like the same, they used the same logic to exhibit a Monet or a Picasso to exhibit things that are actually interactive. So actually interaction was an intellectual fiction more than an actual practice. But that happens, that kind of problem happens with any museum who has within its mission to preserve stuff, not just to exhibit it.
More questions over there? Yeah, another one there. Yeah, but I think they're recording that, so that would be great if you...
I I was actually left very much hanging from where you started, when you started talking, because I'm very interested in that actually, in this thing about meaning and actually the fact that art objects in a way is not only as an artist what you make, but where it's put in.
Yeah.
Because actually a lot of things, if you take them out of the museum,
Yeah.
they're nothing.
Yeah.
If the same object that the artist was thought as an object for art is taken out of the space, it's just, a lot of what it's made. And I remember many years ago, we went to the desert to do this project of residencies, 10 years ago maybe, in a small town, and then is when this arose, because we had like 3 conceptual artists, and actually, in the middle of nowhere, what they were doing was so meaningless. So I would like to know what you think a bit more elaborate about that, about this relationship between not meaning so much of what it means to the artist or what the artist means, but this institutional meaning of objects, that are only meaningful within these spaces. And it's a whole gap, like, there's like an abismo between what we make and then the whole institution around what we make. And if that institution puts it in, it has a meaning. It doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or meaningful for whoever. It's just the fact that MoMA puts something in MoMA or Tate Modern, perhaps. That's it. So what carries meaning today anymore,
Yeah, so that's actually, without having said that, that's actually one of the things that I would like to say. So one of the things so what I'm trying to advance is an ecological understanding of what art is, which means that you cannot think art just in terms of objects, but objects that work within a specific ecology. So that's what I was saying at the end, that what happens between those streets in Manhattan is that first you create the conditions in which things can be objects and acquire meaning. And that is not only just having climatic conditions and having, light and so on and so forth. It's also about the fact that that is a space in which a specific conversation takes place through objects. So when you insert an object there, what you are inserting it in is actually a space that is already occupied by different objects and by different conversations. So it's part of that conversation. If you take it out of context, out of that ecology, it cannot dialogue with anything around it, although land artists would say that that's not true. But in any case, one of the things that I found, for example, which is strange and fascinating at the same time, is that many artists today, when I interview artists at MoMA in different places, they build artwork with a white box in mind, both spatially and conceptually. So the white box is already built into the artwork that they produce. So it's not something that comes after, it's something that comes before. And they produce their artwork with that built, with the white box of the museum space or gallery space built into the artwork. That is what makes it work. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, or we're heading to the coffee, which we're thinking. One more question, or we go to the coffee? Oh, question over there, Daniel. Danny.
Thank you for your talk. It's been very interesting. It's just a very short question. I was wondering about the artistic objects moving around, because it seems to me that the institution is designed to keep the object stable but static at the same time.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, okay, but some of these objects are all the time moving around from one institution to another.
Yeah.
And what happens when
that happens?
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a whole chapter on that.
Okay.
So one of the differences between what I call docile and unruly objects is that docile objects are portable. They're the ones that can be moved. And for example, everybody wants curators love paintings because they can play with them. And for example, when MoMA, one of the reasons why MoMA modified the second floor, the first floor for us, the first floor is because they couldn't fit Richard Serra into the museum. They had to rebuild the whole first floor to create an object-sustaining environment for a Serra. So that's one thing. The other thing that I talked about in that still imaginary chapter is the movement of objects across the world. So one of the fascinating things that happens with these artworks is that you have to create portable ecologies to make them move. So you have to have crates with a specific air conditioning, trucks that are specific fitted to carry artworks. These artworks actually have to have like a sell-by date, because they can only be in a truck for 8 hours, 9 hours, 10 hours, whatever, and the crate's the same. So actually that creates a whole system of movement of objects that demands the standardization of climatic conditions in museums. So now before, if you want to request an artwork from another museum, you have to sign a loan saying that you have the specific climatic conditions that actually will not damage your artwork. That's, for example, why a lot of tropical museums have problems getting artworks, because they cannot guarantee those conditions. So there is a whole system of how these things move and the kind of machines that have to be created to make them move around.
Okay, so perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks for this wonderful talk.